paradox of man. From the moment there was a spoken word, man declared war against his mother nature, tearing down her forests, uprooting her gardens, and ripping mountains and stone from the earth in an attempt to make her in his image. And now that he has conquered nature, his hubris declares war against his father, the spirit. All in the name of progress, a mistress who cares for no one except for the one married to her last. And many men have conjoined themselves with such a mistress. He constructs abominations to pacify himself, to reduce himself to the state of an infant with drugs like opium and hashish. And now that he has conquered his father, he sets his aims on himself. Man creates cradles of stability to protect himself from his mother's whims. Through his understanding of continuity, he's able to develop a sense of permanence in relation to his environment. This is the will of man, to maintain the continuity, or rather the establishment of boundaries. This is that I am me, he is him, and that animal is different from me. Because of this, he can create structures throughout time. But man betrays himself when he indulges in instant gratification, and this is why it is seen as the ultimate vice, because it contradicts the very foundation upon which man realizes his will to power, to dominance over nature, which is chaotic. A man cannot thrive in nature. His body is weak, easily cut and torn, slower and less dexterous. How does this idea of continuity come about? By external interaction with other humans. Through other humans, we come to understand that our actions ripple throughout time, with the world as its medium, and we only begin to realize this when we operate with others in mind. So I reject individualism as the greatest good with every fiber of my being. I believe there is an objective morality, but rationality has suppressed it. I ask myself, what is an emotion? A push or pull towards an object. You ask yourself, is this good for me? But in humans, there is an inherent erosion of boundaries between themselves. We are our group, and they are their group. We are our beliefs, and we are what we do, and they are what they do. And so we ask ourselves, what is good for us? Secondly, looking at it like this, the emotional component is often labeled as subjective, but it is, in fact, a product of the pressure of natural selection, a very real phenomenon. Emotions are instinctual attractions and repulsions with subcategories: love, hate, avarice, humility. The list goes on. While the emotional component may very well be subjective, the realm that precedes it, where everything must answer to functionality as the arbiter, is by its very definition objective. It is removed, detached, and impartial through its unfairness. And in this sense, instinct is subject to nature, and nature is objective. All life has a desire to reproduce and to facilitate goodness for itself, and emotions arise from this drive, through nature, as a mechanism of refinement. If there is no push and pull, no attraction, the mind is not willed to move the body, and an inert body is a dead one. As I began to question the world more and more, I eventually stumbled upon what I believe to be a primordial blight in the human mind. I won't be the first to say similar things, and I certainly won't be the last. However, the answer I arrived at when I was 16, going on 17, drove me into psychosis. This blight is not narcissism, nihilism, or even the broader mental health crisis. They are merely symptoms of a deeper issue. In my eyes, this deeper issue lies in the very principle upon which our society was founded: merit. My friend Elohim once told me, first principles are everything. If our first principle is merit, what does that look like when we construct a castle or a monument upon that foundation? Meritocracy. a system of government or the holding of power by individuals selected based on their ability. On the surface, this sounds fair, even admirable. Yet, to me, what this principle ultimately boils down to is the act of measuring individuals by things that are secondary to themselves. Proxies, you could call them. This approach has undoubtedly served us well as a collective, but I believe it has neglected the individual. If our entire paradigm is structured to see people, and even ourselves, through the proxy of the output they can produce, can we ever truly capture the essence of a person? Can we ever truly see the soul? We are not measuring each other or ourselves by our character, our virtue, our honor, or our integrity, virtues that bridge the gap between the objective experiences we all share and the individual's subjective experiences. Instead, we have abandoned the pursuit of moral standards, and we have suffered because of it. Why do we need moral standards? The answer may surprise some. It's not about defining an objective good or bad. Instead, it's about establishing something akin to, no matter what this is, I am. This is who we are. If you grew up in the era of postmodernity like me, you may feel like this doesn't make sense. That's because postmodernity has it backwards. Humans can perceive the objective world more accurately than any other creature on the planet. This is demonstrated by the extent and depth to which we can interact with and change it. In my eyes, humans don't struggle with this at all. We are capable of producing inputs and using propositional logic to generate accurate outputs. If you graduated high school, I have no doubt you can do this. Given our inherently social nature, I think humans truly struggle in navigating the subjective experience. This struggle is evident in the countless philosophers and thought leaders who have wrestled with questions like, who am I? What am I doing here? What is the meaning of life? Unlike our objective capabilities, these subjective inquiries have yielded no axioms, no absolute truths. Because humans cannot do this, we developed social adaptations to facilitate this process. And it was God who was derivative of a social contract, or perhaps the social contract was derivative of God. But that's another conversation for another day. Humans outsourced their identity to monuments of beauty, and what was beautiful was the epitome of their moral paradigm. This is what Nietzsche means when he says, God is dead, and we killed him. How do we know this? Or better yet, how do I know? Just look at the archetypes or monuments we construct and worship. In the modern era, our heroes are no longer something to behold above us, reflecting what we could aspire to be. Instead, they are something to relate to, designed to make us comfortable. The human spirit wanted to free itself from God, but in doing so, it trapped itself in endless inquiries about its own nature. It began to exhibit the same behavior as its ancestors, building archetypes to fill the void. But unlike those of our ancestors, today's archetypes do not seek to inspire or uplift. They seek only to relate. The mental health of the individual is important because the cumulative health of all individuals affects the group's mental health. In turn, the group's mental health affects the individuals that make up the group. It's hard to say where one starts and the other begins because we must look so far back in time to ascertain that. As I understand it, forming connections with others around social structures with varying degrees of complexity has been a part of mankind's development as a species. This is arguably the main contributor to why we are here today. Therefore, it can be inferred that the integrity of the psyche of the group, and by extension the individual, or the psyche of the individual, and by extension the group, is vital if we are to progress as a species. Right now, we are experiencing a mental health crisis in America. According to a 2022 survey of 1,055 Gen Z adults, 42% have a diagnosed mental health condition, and more than a quarter of those were diagnosed during the COVID-19 pandemic or later. In addition, 1 in 3 18 to 24-year-olds now report symptoms of depression or anxiety disorder, compared with 1 in 4 in 2000. I don't know what is causing this, but I have an idea. The first thing that popped into my mind was to correlate mental health issues with the urbanization or industrialization of an area. However, thankfully, the work had already been done. According to the Center of Urban Design for Mental Health, people in urban areas compared to rural areas are 40% more at risk of developing depression, and their chances of developing schizophrenia are doubled. They are also 20% more at risk of anxiety. If this is the case, we can assume that urbanization is detrimental to the mental health of the individual, and by extension, the group. If this is the case, and this is a cause and not a correlation, then I have an idea. Now, I know some people may be tired of hearing this man's name, but I have to mention him as my entire argument or proposition is hinged on one of his lectures. His name is Jordan Peterson. In his lecture, he says that the mental health of an individual is derived from the group. He says they used to think it was an internal mechanism, but they learned it was not. Based on this, my mind took a leap of faith and concluded that if people's mental health is tied to the group, and that is the only way they can gauge their sanity, what happens when you can't see the effect your actions are having on the people or the community you live in? What happens when there are so many groups with different values that nobody knows what hierarchy of values to judge themselves by? I think we end up with half of a generation dealing with mental health issues. The next idea ties religion into this. Religion was the only way ancient societies could manage such large populations. When the fastest speed authority figures in different duchies or even cities could communicate with each other was the speed of a horse. This was a problem. It is this gap between the action and the reward or punishment that leads people to even contemplate going against the will that the central authority figure propagates. But a person's conscious thoughts are always with them wherever they go, regardless of how far they travel. People may argue that modern society has a sense of right and wrong. I take Nietzsche's stance on this. The only reason those people have these inherent feelings of right and wrong is because of the will of Jesus and God living on, even in the minds of people who no longer consciously believe. This only serves as a testament to the will of God and how powerful it is in maintaining order in a society that has abandoned him. Bringing these ideas together, religion provides an objective value system for the individuals within the group or society to orient their subjective experiences around, thus grounding everyone in a shared reality or perception of reality. If everyone is operating off of the same framework, and religion does plant the seeds for this faith, or rather shared beliefs that hold our fellow man to a higher standard than he is predisposed to keep himself to, it could be crucial to maintaining the stability of a nation, or even simply a small group. I'm not arguing for the existence of God, but for the importance of faith in established institutions. If I were to sum this up once more, it would be that a shared belief system for people to see themselves through is integral to developing one's identity and self-concept, which is crucial for one's mental state or sanity. Religion provided this for centuries. And so, with the conquering of nature, through his permanent structures and the dismantling of his spirit as a symptom of said permanence, it seems we are put into a position where we can't win. My question is, why would nature do this? And I think that this is universal across mammals. At the very least, as demonstrated with the rat utopia experiment, It ultimately ended in the deconstruction of the social hierarchies that organized the rat society and propagated their species. This is my warning to the world. Or perhaps it is hoped that even if we've damaged ourselves beyond repair, Mother Nature burns it down to make room for new societies or even species. Eventually, this is the primordial blight nestled so deep within the mind of man and animal alike. Should anyone read this, be it now or militia later, I plead with you, do not follow in our footsteps, for this is why God decreed that city building was inherently evil in all its forms. The human mind is not wired to live without objects to move toward through the mechanism of emotions. In my time observing children as a behavior technician, I've come to a realization. Children develop complexes to orient themselves and navigate the social realm toward reinforcers or objects of desire. In this sense, humans are naturally pathological, underscoring the importance of having functional social structures. The moral framework serves as a series of reinforcers through the mechanism of validation to shape human behavior. All this was allowed because humans believe themselves to be separate from animals. But make no mistake, any animal, once they reach a certain population threshold, would experience this, be they terrestrial or not. I believe that the occult is correct, in the sense that you lose a part of yourself when you sleep with someone. I would argue that the self is primarily an assertion of boundaries between things you believe to be within your territory or things in your possession, maybe even simply an act of aggression in its most fundamental form. The Hindus teach that the chakra responsible for sexual drive seeks to conjoin and erode the boundary between a person and another spiritually and literally, physically. The implication here is that each time you are intimate with someone, you erode the boundary between yourself and them. You lose part of your territory, or that which is within your possession. I believe this puts the individual in a state of distress. A more relatable example is when you gorge yourself on food only to feel disgusted with yourself. This is because you have violated yourself and given up a part of your territory, in a sense, your impulses. You have become like an animal, and further from what we would call God. God, in this sense, is the culmination of all the behaviors and inclinations that are good for humankind. They are good for humanity because they organize him in such a way that he may realize his dominion on earth, the will that every creature, be it conscious or not, possesses. Man has declawed himself with the globalization of society, which led to moral relativism. The external frameworks and the foundation for his ego gaslight him into oblivion with the birth of moral relativism. In this sense, he is a child before a narcissistic parent that will not reciprocate his love, no matter how much he please in. He has turned away from the Father and to his adversary, Satan. The devil, at least. That's how I would imagine St. Augustine would put it. And man has declawed himself because man works best when he asked himself what is good for us, as opposed to what is good for me, because he is put simply a social creature. His survival hinges on his social frameworks and structures more than any other animal on the planet. Thus, I must lament that the human spirit in its desire to usurp the throne of God and realize its own agency has become trapped by its own vices and reaped the seeds of its own destruction. God, the divine, the masculine, represents all static things. The devil, the feminine, represents dynamism and movement, time which measures. Movement is the only way we can realize what is static. A lack gives rise to movement. This is seen in the universe itself. If you take water out of a cup, The rest of the water fills the void, a nothingness. This void gives rise to movement and is the only way we can realize something is. There. The static, the masculine, is realized through the feminine, to worship. Order alone is to reject life and deny the very means by which you came to. Understand that order. In this sense, God embodies the opposite of life, of will. Will wants to move, but man needs things that are static throughout time. To lift himself out of hell, hence the human struggle. We do not fight merely for our bodies, but for our souls, for our way of life, for our wives, our husbands, our children, for our future. I believe we have made a grave error in the answers to these questions in our modern era. The death urge has usurped and driven the zeitgeist into a mindless frenzy as it seeks to tear itself apart. What is the death urge? I believe the Greeks understood it as eros, the feminine will for harmony. The feminine will seeks to erode the boundaries between things, and this is why many men have sought to covet, control, and direct it, looking at it from an evolutionary perspective, but also with this frame of reference. To get the clearest and most concise view, you must look to the origin, and all origin arises from function. I posit the idea that men, because of their inherent vulnerabilities compared to other animals, seek to establish permanent boundaries with the world, even though men are strong enough to fight physically. I also posit that the mind is an extension of the body's capabilities. I also posit that women, in their vulnerability towards the physical world, like their male counterparts, and their period of vulnerability during childbearing, would have to be attached to men for survival during their period of vulnerability. Not that there weren't female hunters, which we are discovering there were. So I think the Greeks saw that the women who would survive would be the ones that could erode the mental boundaries between herself and a man, where he would be attached enough to not leave her behind. Whereas perhaps they saw the man as establishing boundaries between other men in regards to what was their territory. But what's more interesting is how this simple relationship between people can establish an entire paradigm for viewing the world. Of course, provided the Greeks were right. And as I posited, the erosion of boundaries, or the equilibrium of the intensity between objects, would dissolve human consciousness. This could be why female sexuality was seen as something to fear and control. Maybe the occult understood something. And yet, without this feminine will, society wouldn't function. There would be no empathy, which is necessary for humans to function as a collective. How would the feminine will relate to the development of sentience? I imagine myself in a void. Nothing, no movement, just stillness. Applied behavioral analysis proposes that children develop complexes before an obstacle they must navigate to reach an object of desire. Human behavior can be reduced to 3 constants: attraction, repulsion, and the complex that must arise from becoming one with the obstacle. Imagine that something pops into existence. This incongruity in the environment stimulates the brain. The brain extends its ethereal form around the object, feeling it as if it were some sort of cosmic goop that bends itself around the environment through neuroplasticity. What's really interesting is how the mind recognizes something is there to begin with, and for this, there's literally no language. The closest word I can use is movement. Actually, I have it. The intensity of the SD in ABA is what I think we call it. Movement is merely a vector. This intensity can manifest in many ways. If everything were of the same intensity, be it color, movement, size, shape, there would be no incongruity in the environment, and thus the mind would have no anchor. And thus why the feminine and the rise of matriarchies is to be feared. The father of Christianity is a woman. The Christian paradigm fundamentally wants to erode the boundary between man and woman alike, with the idea that we will love one another, as each of us was within each other. But if we are all in each other, what is the distinction between you and me? Then it becomes, who am I? It becomes, why am I even here without a who? It erodes the basis for which sentience arises, parameters, boundaries, hierarchy between objects in the environment. And now this feminine will seek to undermine our biological imperative, our children, our babies. At the apex of its power, it makes no distinctions between anyone or anything. We are all equal in the same way, it will say, as it dissolves the innards of your mind. But if we are all the same in every way, what makes me valuable? It is this erosion of the value of the human life that is the precedent for so many atrocities, reducing people down to quantitative units. And lastly, for the killing of our own offspring, a fetus is human, I tell you, that's human blood. Not only is it human blood, but there's this as well. If I were to tell you to explain to me what a bullet is, you would probably tell me it is something that is fired from a gun. If I were to ask you to explain what a car is, the most intuitive way to explain it would be something you drive. What I'm trying to say is that something's potential, its capacity, is the metric we primarily define everything by, no exceptions. This is even reflected in our sentence structure, noun, verb, adjective. Trying to explain something by operating itself from its future state is like trying to remove those two things from your language. You have to start playing mental games and gaslighting yourself to do it. And that's exactly what the people of today have done. Why is a fetus the exception to something so fundamentally rooted in our perception of the world? I ask myself, and I bet none of you would argue that the human is less valuable than a gun based on its potential, which cannot be separated from the object itself. This is not a declaration of what we ought to value, but what we already assign value to at the most fundamental level. We have been lied to. I believe that the occult is correct in the sense that you lose a part of yourself when you sleep with someone. I would argue that the self is primarily an assertion of boundaries between things you believe to be within your territory or things in your possession. Maybe even simply an act of aggression in its most fundamental form. The Hindus teach that the chakra responsible for sexual drive seeks to conjoin and erode the boundary between a person and another spiritually and literally, physically. The implication here is that each time you are intimate with someone, you erode the boundary between yourself and them. You lose part of your territory, or that which is within your possession. I believe this puts the individual in a state of distress. A more relatable example is when you gorge yourself on food only to feel disgusted with yourself. This is because you have violated yourself and given up a part of your territory, in a sense, your impulses. You have become like an animal, and further from what we would call God. God, in this sense, is the culmination of all the behaviors and inclinations that are good for humankind. They are good for humanity because they organize him in such a way that he may realize his dominion on earth, the will that every creature, be it conscious or not, possesses. And since we are creatures of habit, and habits are not just habits but modes of thought, what we practice in one area of our life ripples into others. Sex is something that must be indulged in seldomly, an act that relinquishes the territory of men over to the territory of beast. Must be treated with caution, and the one thing that truly separates man from animal is his relationship with time and ability to relate to others through time. Why would you commit ideological suicide? We do not live in a world by ourselves. We do not merely answer to ourselves, not even to our own consequence. If we are not careful with what we choose to practice and believe, we will answer to the whips and chains of our enemies. You are mistaken if you think natural selection only applies to evolution. And surely, mistaken if you believe evolution only applies to physical matters. It applies to every avenue of life and the world. But most importantly, in the human case, ideologies. Is the universe truly indifferent? And if the universe is indifferent, does that justify us being indifferent to ourselves? I believe that we answer to our past selves in the form of consequences. Consequences are an ethereal force, bending the world around our corporeal form. In a sense, I matter. My choices matter because I will suffer from them or benefit from them. In this sense, we are not powerless. We have power through our understanding of temporal relations. People say we're powerless, and so I asked myself what power is. I came to the conclusion that it is the ability to influence through the application and management of one's resources. Those who can manage and apply their resources most effectively are the most powerful. Why efficiency? Because resources are finite. Therefore, put simply, not everyone can win. I've encountered many complexes in my life, and ever since high school, I've had the capacity to see through the facades of my friends. When people speak to me, I don't just see their words, but their values. My understanding, which I came to in order to cope with it all, is that people act on what they value. The mind is a battlefield where one value asserts its dominion over another. By realizing one, you're excluding another. Why do I think this? I ask myself, because people only develop complexes to navigate their way toward an object of desire. But I ask myself, are people pathological by nature? Strategy is not a matter of arbitrary laws and logic, but a matter of recognizing will and direction. It is in the realm of ethics, by Jung's definition at least. Emotions are an attraction or repulsion towards an object. All life wills itself towards what is good for it. So if you recognize what someone's emotional disposition towards something is, you know what resource they are fighting for or the danger they are avoiding. And if you know what they value, you will always be a step ahead. Why is this the case? It is because only through recognizing constants can we interface with variables, much like in an algebraic equation. People and the mind cannot move both left and right at the same time. The mind is beholden to the same rules as the body, because the mind is the body. We don't grab trees with our feet because they lack opposable thumbs. An elephant doesn't grab things with its feet for the same reason, just as we don't think to grab things with our noses. With this in mind, the mind, by default, has parameters by which it organizes itself toward a goal through the mechanisms of the body. To move towards something is to not move towards other things. This movement of the mind is what we call focus. By this principle, by merely thinking, we are ignoring another aspect of the world. And my friend, it is emotion that moves the mind, and the mind that moves the body. Does the modern man realize that by partaking in the tree of knowledge, his rationalism, his objectivity, he has suppressed his limbic system, and thus the very thing that animates his vessel, his emotions, his instincts? He has committed spiritual suicide. I must say that the mistreatment and exploitation of the sexual instinct and of sexual preservation, tied to the third Hindu chakra, if I'm correct, is the most heinous crime against humanity. Why? Because the drive to reproduce is the foundation for all living organisms, And I would go so far as to say it disgusts me in the same way that someone grooming a child would, because it's a violation of the core of life itself. Put bluntly, what these gender theorists and gender studies, with all their papers, have failed to realize, in my opinion, because their ideologies destroy the faculties required to see it, is this. The sexual instinct is directly tied to morality, and without proper institutions, people will cling to anything to signal sexual attractiveness, like cars, status, chaos. The craziest example is the mutilation of one's own genitals. But all of this is just to paint a picture for what I'm about to say next. Whatever behaviors are seen as sexually desirable, based on the demands of the environment, become the foundation for the moral framework of a society. Do what you will with this information. Sigmund Freud cooked Carl Jung was right. Modern psychology is a joke. I believe that, with progressions within the field of quantum mechanics, we will come to prove that Jung was ahead of his time, further than any prophet has ever been, including Tesla and Einstein. Why do I say this? If the universe is, in fact, non-local, and there are probability waves collapsing everywhere all at once, then that would also mean that thoughts, the chemical synapses in your brain, exist in every possible configuration, everywhere, all at once. To make this easier to understand, imagine you have a fan, the kind that spins. The faster it spins, the more likely it is that you will touch it when you put your hand against it. This is how physical matter works, and the mind is subject to it.